Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Wednesday night worship this week. We are continuing in the book of Acts. Our new series was introduced to us last week by Sue. She explained that really we're picking up where we left off in the book of Acts last year. And Sue took us through a little bit of Acts chapter 15. And we're going to be picking up on the next passage, which is Acts 16, verses 1 to 5. So what I plan to do in this short video here is to read the passage. I'll share a few thoughts to get us thinking, and then later on when we meet via Zoom, we'll be able to continue that discussion, think a little bit more about the passage, and then pray together. So let me read this passage to us. It's Acts chapter 16, verses 1 to 5. Paul came to Derbe and then to Lystra, where a disciple named Timothy lived, whose mother was Jewish and a believer, but whose father was a Greek. The believers at Lystra and Iconium spoke well of him. Paul wanted to take him along on the journey, so he circumcised him because of the Jews who lived in that area, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. As they travelled from town to town, they delivered the decisions reached by the apostles and elders in Jerusalem for the people to obey. So the churches were strengthened in the faith and grew daily in numbers. Great. Well, that short little passage is a little bit of a link from the previous passage, which we saw that council at Jerusalem. And then we see as Paul takes the decision from that council to different churches, off to Antioch, and then to some other churches, and then now to some of the churches in Galatia. And that sort of acts as a bit of a bridge to Paul's ongoing journey, which we'll be following through in the coming weeks. And as we see in verses 4 to 5 of our passage, as he's travelling from town to town in this region of Galatia, he's delivering the decisions reached by the apostles and the elders in Jerusalem for the people to obey. And as he does this, the churches are strengthened in the faith, it says, and they grew daily in numbers. Now let's just refresh our memory. What is this decision that he is delivering? Well, do you remember the issue that was being addressed at the Jerusalem Council was one of circumcision? Back in chapter 15, verse 1, it said that certain people came down from Judea to Antioch, where Paul was, and was teaching the believers, unless you're circumcised according to the custom taught by Moses, you cannot be saved. And then it says that there was a big stand-up row. This brought Paul and Barnabas into sharp dispute and debate with them. Because, of course, we know Paul had been preaching that Gentiles, non-Jews, could come to faith in Jesus Christ and could be saved only through faith in Jesus Christ. But then came along this other group of people from Jerusalem who were saying, no, believing in Jesus is very, very important. That's all well and good. But you do know that to be truly saved and to be truly certain of your salvation, you need to become Jewish. They were saying you need to be circumcised according to the law of Moses. And this was the issue, of course, that Paul writes about in the letters to the Galatians, which we studied on Sunday mornings a few months ago. And at this point, Paul had already written his letter to the Galatians, again, refuting that idea that you needed to add circumcision to faith in Jesus in order to be saved. Paul was saying, no. Non-Jews can be saved through faith in Jesus alone. You don't need to be circumcised. You don't need to become Jewish and abide by the food laws and the Sabbaths and all these kind of things in order to be saved. And that was what was agreed upon by the elders and the apostles at the council in Jerusalem. That was the decision that Paul was taking to the churches, saying, no, definitely sure, I've got the rubber stamp of approval, you don't need to be circumcised. Faith in Jesus is all that can save, all you need to do to be saved. Trust in him. So it's rather strange and awkward that as Paul takes out this message and this decision, that we immediately come across Timothy, and that Paul immediately takes the decision to circumcise Timothy. We saw that in verse 3 of our passage. And we scratch our head. We say, well, is Paul being inconsistent here? Is Paul compromising here? The answer to both those things is no. Paul might be lots of things, but he's not inconsistent, and he certainly doesn't compromise in the face of pressure. Now, Luke here gives us some very important details about Timothy's lineage, about Timothy's ancestry, that helps us understand a little bit about what's going on here. Verse 1, when we're introduced to Timothy, we're told that actually he was half Jewish. It said his mother is Jewish, come to faith in Jesus, was a Jewish Christian, and his father was a Greek. Later on he's referred to in the past tense, implication being he's probably dead now. And it seems that his Greek father objected to him being circumcised according to the Jewish custom. So Timothy was half Jewish, but uncircumcised. Now, we need to recognise that in the estimation of most of the Jews in the area in that day, that would have made Timothy an apostate Jew. To be half Jewish but not circumcised, he was an apostate Jew. And what that would have meant is that Timothy was prevented from access to that Jewish community. Timothy was prevented from access to the synagogue. And if Paul had have taken his young protege Timothy along as his companion, that would have also prevented Paul from having access to the synagogue and to the Jewish community. And so it seems that circumcising Timothy was a very deliberate and strategic decision in order to be able to reach the Jewish community with the gospel. That's the reason for the decision in verse 3. It says Paul wanted to take Timothy along on the journey, so he circumcised him because of the Jews who lived in that area, for they knew that his father was a Greek. They knew he was uncircumcised, and so he wouldn't have had access to this Jewish community. Now, Luke is a master writer. He's not stupid. And it's not just coincidence that he's put this jarring encounter here. Just as the decision has been made that circumcision is not necessary, and as Paul is taking that decision out to the Gentile churches, it's not a coincidence that Luke has decided to put this circumcision of Timothy right here as a bit of a jarring moment. He's done it to make, I think, two important points. The first point is that Jews, the Jewish community, are included in the promises of the gospel. The Jewish community are included in the invitation of the gospel and are included in the mission of Paul and the mission of the church. Luke is wanting to make the point here that opening the door to the Gentiles does not mean closing the door to the Jews. No, what Jesus is doing through the gospel is making one new people, one new humanity, where the dividing wall has been taken away, and both Jew and Gentile are saved through faith in Jesus Christ. And I think this portion of Acts is underlining that point, that Paul, as he went on his ministry and mission to the Gentiles, that did not mean he was excluding Jews from the promise of the gospel. It also especially didn't mean that Paul was teaching Jews to forsake the Torah of Moses. Paul wasn't going about saying to Jews that they shouldn't be circumcised, but he was saying it wasn't necessary for salvation. So this is making a very important point, that no one is excluded from the gospel on the basis of their ethnicity. There is no discrimination between people on the basis of their ethnicity, particularly in this case with regards to Jews and non-Jews. And that is still an important lesson for us to hear today. Sadly, we have to keep repeating it because anti-Semitism is still alive and well in our communities and in our nation. We have very recently in our news heard about terrible cases of anti-Semitism, terrible toleration of anti-Semitism, terrible quarters in society and even our politics where it seems to be breeding grounds for anti-Semitism. And this passage says there is no place for that in the church, there is no place for that in our church. But there's also no place for any discrimination or racism of any kind, and that bears repeating because just in this previous week, of course, we've seen the terrible death of George Floyd, as a white police officer knelt on this black man's neck for 8.5 minutes until the man was dead. And so we must keep repeating that any type of racism, any type of exclusion, any type of discrimination based on ethnicity is completely and utterly wrong. It is abhorrent and it is against the premise of the gospel. That gospel message is to all. That's one of the points Luke is making here. There's another really important point, I think, that this short passage makes. And it shows the gospel flexibility in Paul's ministry. Now, Paul, of course, could be very, very inflexible, and rightly so. When it came to the essence and heart of the gospel, he would not move. When it came to people saying you had to be circumcised in order to be saved, he said no. And when the church found a unity around this decision, it was not a unity at all costs. It wasn't a smudgy, mudgy, wishy-washy unity that just included everything. It said, no, you are wrong and this is right. It said to those people who were insisting on circumcision, no, that is a false gospel, and if you continue to teach that gospel, you are not included in this. So our unity is not to be a unity at all costs, it's to be a unity in the gospel. There is an inflexibility there. But that gospel gives us a freedom to be very, very flexible then in the method and the culture of how we go about our ministry. Paul recognised that freedom in the gospel meant that actually he could encourage Timothy to be circumcised as a cultural thing to enable reaching certain people. He speaks about this gospel freedom in 1 Corinthians. He says this, though I am free and belong to no one, I have made myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. To the Jews I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those not having the law I became like one not having the law, although I am not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. To the weak I became weak to win the weak. I've become all things to all people, so that by all means possible I might save some. I do all this for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessings. Paul recognised that the gospel gave him great freedom in terms of the method, in terms of the culture, so that to the Jew he could become like the Jew, and the Greek he could become like the Greek, which meant that for the sake of reaching these people, he could take away that stumbling block of Timothy being uncircumcised. And of course, that flexibility and that freedom also involved sacrifice, particularly for Timothy. Ouch! You know, that was a big sacrifice that he took. He became Jewish, a good Jew, rather than an apostate Jew, in order to reach these people with the gospel. And I wonder if there's something of a lesson there for us as well. Seeing this flexibility, this freedom, this sacrifice in the way that they go about their ministry. I wonder, where do we need to insist less on doing things our way and the way we like things, in a way that is culturally comfortable for us? And where do we need to be more flexible in order to reach people that we are not yet reaching? So I wonder if, as we chat in our Zoom group, whether there's two areas for us to think about. The inclusion of the gospel, and are we excluding certain people or certain demographics with our ministry? And also the flexibility of the way that we go about things. Are we inadvertently putting stumbling blocks in people's way in the cultural way we do things, or the method in the way that we're doing things? We'll have a chat about that over Zoom. See you there.